Anyway, the good news this morning is that I am being allowed to give this talk at this place when many other places would forbid me to give it. I was going to say that the bad news was that the audience was going to be on my side, but since I heard yesterday morning's talk on sex, I realized that that might not be the case. So we'll probably have a case of skeptic versus skeptic here. And you can make up your own minds. The topic of my talk is the ideological subversion of biology, which is the incursion of certain political ideologies into biology in a way that distorts the truth. And this was published in a paper in Skeptical Inquirer. By the way, I get a chip for that. Skeptical Inquirer, another chip. It was by Luana Moroja at Williams College and myself, in which we took 6 areas of our own field, evolutionary biology, in which we detected that ideology had distorted those fields. And those 6 fields are here. Actually, I'll just do it with the clickers. These are the distortions. There's 6 of them, but I'm not going to talk about all of them because I simply don't have time. The ones I'm going to talk about are the ones that are most controversial. First, the assertion, which is incorrect, that sex in human is not a discrete and binary distribution of males and females, but it forms a spectrum. You heard about that yesterday morning on the other side. Again, make up your own mind. And then the hottest potato of all, the claim that race and ethnicity are social constructs without scientific or biological meaning. And I want to unpack that because it's a very complicated issue. Let's start with sex. The contention that sex in humans is not discrete binary, i.e. males and females, but is a spectrum. It's either continuous or it has lumps in it. And that's more or less what people are talking about when they make this assertion. Here's a graph in which there's a variety of biological sexes on the x-axis and the frequency of individuals of those different sexes on the y-axis. Now here we have a bimodal distribution, which is what we see for gender, more or less. But I'm talking about biological sex, not gender. You have to remember that. So we see a lot of males, a lot of females, but there's also intermediates, intersex individuals in between, and then individuals which are outside the spectrum completely. They consider themselves not having a sex, and there are such individuals. The spectrum doesn't have to be humped like this. It can be like a straight line or a curve, but the upshot is that there's many, many different kinds of biological sexes. People that make this claim never tell us how many or what they are, and that claim is wrong. But it's a widespread claim. In fact, here is The Lancet, which is a very famous journal, medical journal in Britain, and here you can see sex and gender are often incorrectly portrayed as binary, female, male, or woman, man. So here we have a primo medical journal saying that sex is a spectrum. Journal of Anatomy, same thing. Despite the recognition that sex is a spectrum, now I know a lot of biologists, but I don't know any of them who recognize that as a fact, although there's a lot of lay people who do. Scientific American, which unfortunately in my view is circling the drain, began going downhill in 2018 when it made this article, Sex Redefined, the idea of 2 sexes is overly simplistic. This is 6 years ago, so the incursion was already beginning then. This is echoed by, on the left, a tweet by Laura Helmuth, who's the editor of Scientific American, and here she talks about the white-throated sparrow. And she says there are 4 sexes. You can see sex is not binary at the bottom there. Well, if you look up the white-throated sparrow in any bird book, you're going to see, yes, there are males and yes, there are females, and each sex has 2 different patterns and colors with them. So they're not 4 sexes, there's 2 sexes, but each sex comes in 2 different colors and patterns. So this is a misleading statement by the editor of America's premier popular scientific journal. This ideology has also invaded scientific organizations. Here's a statement on the right from the Society for the Study of Evolution, of which I was once president, but I'm now embarrassed about, because they've made this statement in red that sex should be more accurately viewed as a continuum. That's not true, as I will try to convince you. But they also talk about gender, and gender being sort of the sex role that you perform in society, that I would be willing to say is more of a continuum. So I'm not a hardcore about how people identify, but I'm a hardcore about the biology involved in sex. It's also invaded schools. Here's two tropes that we see in elementary schools. On the left, we have the gender unicorn, and you can see that they say sex is assigned at birth. This is very common, not that sex is recognized or at birth, but sex is assigned at birth, as if there's some kind of menu that doctors have, and they just pick out somebody's sex almost at random. On the right, we have the genderbread person, which is very common in elementary schools. And the genderbread person tells us that sex is a continuum from males through intersex individuals to females. So the indoctrination of people into this kind of ideological view of science begins very early. And unfortunately, some people never shed it. Now, there are four issues about sex that we have to distinguish when we're talking about biological sex. Again, remember, I'm not talking about gender. We have to keep gender, which is a psychological view of what your sex role is, apart from biological sex. But when we're considering biological sex, and remember I'm a biologist, so that's why I'm talking about this, there's three things you have to remember. First of all, the definition of biological sex. How do biologists define sex? And using that definition, how many sexes are there? Okay? That's different from how the sexes develop. Given that we have males and females largely, which is what I'll maintain, well, what is it that sets an individual zygote on the pathway to becoming male versus female? And as we learn, there's a lot of different things, but they all wind up at two endpoints, males versus females. But how you define sex is different from how sex develops, because there are many ways that you can get to sexes. And finally, the ascertainment. When a baby is newborn, how do you tell whether it's a male or a female? Well, you all know how they do. They look at the penis, they could look at the chromosomes. You can even look at the fetus with ultrasound and determine its sex this way. But what I want to emphasize is that sex is not assigned, it is ascertained by doctors at birth. Okay. We use proxies for that. So here's the definition of biological sex that has been going amongst biologists, and especially evolutionary biologists, since about the late 1800s. About 1892 was the first time it's been defined. And again, you can define sex in lots of different ways. What I'm promulgating here is simply the way that biologists recognize sex, especially evolutionary biologists. And it's based on the reproductive anatomy of the individual and the type of gamete or sex cell that it's designed to produce. And there are two of these. We have large, and this is true in all animals, every single species of animal and all vascular plants. There are two kinds of reproductive systems. One designed to produce a large immobile gamete, which are eggs in humans, and sperm, which are mobile, the small ones. And in plants, it's the ovule, the egg, and the pollen, which is mobile and is the sort of sperm equivalent. As I said before, this is a universality. Every species of animal we know of conforms to this binary differences in the types of reproductive systems they produce. Let me add two things. First of all, some individuals, a lot of plants, and a few species like mollusks have both reproductive systems in single individuals, hermaphrodites. In humans, they're very rare. One in, I think, 0.001%, 1/1000th of 1% of individual humans are hermaphrodites. So it's almost negligible in terms of sex. And if you want to say this disrupts the binary, we'll say, oh, fine. I'll say it's very, very close to a binary with a few exceptions. The other thing I want to mention, and this was the subject of yesterday's talk, is that yesterday's talk was confined completely to humans. You know, humans have a variety of sexes, and it's all based on modules in their brain. They are what they think they are. Well, people think all kinds of things about themselves, but I won't go into that now. But I want to say that this whole controversy about sex exists only in the species Homo sapiens. Nobody worries in biology about whether foxes have a spectrum of sexes or whether alligators have a spectrum of sexes. It's only humans. And that gives you a clue about why we are privileged to have this definition that's universal in biology, but in ideology applies only to our own species. So that takes care of the definition. It's universal. I'll tell you later that it also has great utility, and it's also parsimonious because it applies across the animal and plant kingdom. Sex is defined by gametes. How is it determined? Well, there's a number of different factors that determine whether you turn out male or female. In humans, of course, it's genes on chromosomes, XX, XY, although those genes can get off the chromosomes. And some species, it's just genes themselves. And some species, it's temperature, like in reptiles. Turtles, for example, their rearing temperature in the egg will determine whether they come out male or female. It's social factors in the famous clownfish, which is always used as an example of a violation of the sex binary. In fact, there's a bunch of males and an alpha and female. If that female dies or goes away, one of the males changes sex from male to female to become the alpha female. But there's still only two sexes. That male just gets rid of his ability to produce sperm and then produces eggs. Clownfish have two sexes. They don't have three sexes or anything like that, okay? And in hymenopterans, like ants or bees, if you have a half set of chromosomes, that is your haploid, you turn out to be a male, a drone, whereas if you have a full set of chromosomes, then you're a female, either a worker or the queen. So you can see there's all these different factors that go into making sex, but the end point is always males and females. Sex has evolved independently 5 times over the course of evolution, and yet, in every case, it only produces males and females, which raises a couple of interesting evolutionary questions that I hope to get to in a minute. Lots of different pathways, 2 endpoints. Now, the question is, are sexes assigned at birth? You're going to see this increasingly in the literature. Always cast a cold eye on a statement when you see that. Sexes are not assigned at birth, they're determined at birth or ascertained at birth, and they're usually done so by using proxy features, secondary sexual traits like the penis, whether or not it has a penis or a vagina, or looking at the chromosomes. These are almost 100% correlated with the type of gametes that they produce, or could produce if they were fertile, but they're not 100% reliable. So we can have an individual with a vestigial penis or an individual with a vestigial vagina and penis together. But when you look at their reproductive system, almost 100% of the time, you see that there's only a system designed to produce sperm or eggs. Now, the number of individuals that violate this sex binary, as I said, is minute. So I'm willing to say, well, it's non-binary, but the non-binary part is negligibly small. How small is it? About 1 individual in 5,600, or 0.02% are intersex. That is, we cannot tell. I think this is actually an overestimate by a substantial amount, but I'll be willing to discuss that with anybody. But at maximum, it's 1 individual in 5,600 that is a violation of the sex binary, okay? This is almost exactly the chances if you toss a nickel in the air, it lands on its edge. Okay, so I find it very odd that people that are willing to say that sex is a spectrum because of this 1 in 5,600 violation, when they flip a coin, they don't say, call it heads, tails, or edge. They recognize that flipping a coin is as close to getting a binary result as you can get. And yet, well, it's all politics, okay? I'll talk more about that later, so. This is the nature of the sex binary. This is what I conceive of as the binary, where you plot the sexes and their frequencies. And we see on the left 50% male, on the right 50% female, and the intersex individuals in the middle, 0.02%. I've even exaggerated the height of that intersex lump just to make it visible. But you can see there's 2 peaks and a little bit of intermediacy. This is as close to a binary as you can get. So when I say sex is binary, this is exactly what I mean, okay? Why then do people insist that sex is not a binary, even in that sense, but as a spectrum, that there's a gazillion sexes. They never tell us how many or which ones they are, but they say it's a spectrum. To take a line from Chinatown, it's ideology, Jake. That is, that people feel that because gender is a continuum, and it is more or less a spectrum because there are people of all different genders who identify themselves as different, that therefore biology must also be a spectrum. And here they're conflating sex and gender. In one case, we do have a more continuous distribution, and the other, we just have two peaks. This is an example of people reading into nature what they feel is ideologically correct, a move that I call the reverse appeal to nature, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But it's an example of how people feel that what is good in humans must be what we see in nature. This is a really bad mistake for a skeptic to make, to think that their feelings actually correspond to reality. Okay, but this is why people, in my view, this is why people insist that sex is a spectrum. Why is it important? Well, first of all, it's a universal pattern in all animals and plants. There are no exceptions. You either have a reproductive system to produce big immogates or small mobile ones. It has great utility in understanding the evolution of reproductive systems, as I'll show you in a second. And finally, it has an explanatory power that no other definition of sex has. What is this explanatory power? It explains why males and females are different from one another in many species based on sexual selection. Because males and females invest different amounts of energy and reproductive resources into gametes, that leads to what Darwin called sexual selection in 1871, and that differential investment explains why males and females are different in so many ways. For example, they differ morphologically. Here's male and female duck on the top, males and female primates at the bottom. You all know that males and females are morphologically distinguishable in many species. There's a difference in physiology. Here's a graph of grip strength in males versus females over their age. Age is on the x-axis from 8 to 80. Grip strength is on the y-axis with the orange representing males, the purple representing females. And as you can see, there's some overlap at every age, but in general, there's a very big average difference between the two sexes. And this is the athletic ability, which is one reason why males and females are divided into different leagues when they have sports. And finally, there's a difference in choosing. If there's a universal in the animal kingdom, is that males are choosier in their mates than females, okay? This is a graph from Steve Stewart Williams from OkCupid, where at the top, females were divided into their degree of attractiveness by another group and lumped on the x-axis. On the y-axis is how attractive males find the females from those different classes. And as you can see, males find pretty much every class of females somewhat attractive. There's about 60% of males are above the mean, find that the most attractive women are attractive, but you can see that even the women that are judged independently as less attractive are attractive to males. At the bottom, the graph is same graph for females, and here you see something very different. You see that only a small percentage of females find males attractive. I think it's like almost 0% at the very top. And this is verified by any kind of, I used to give my class an exercise to go through OkCupid or Tinder and rate the males and females, and sure enough, the males and the females would be very different from one another. You could do this experiment yourself if you have access to a class. This difference in choosability comes directly from the difference in gamete size, because females have to be pickier about their mates because they have fewer reproductive opportunities than males do that can spread their sperm very widely. So this is a universal observation in the animal kingdom, and it is one that can only be explained by assuming a sex binary. At the end here, I just want to emphasize that this controversy about whether sex is a spectrum, again, it applies only to humans. We biologists don't spend our time worrying about whether ducks or foxes or chickens or whatever have a spectrum of sex, okay? It's only humans. And according to Timothy McHale, Of millions of species on Earth, we're the only one that require a privileged reading for something as fundamental as biological sex. He calls us a case of textbook anthropocentrism. It is human exceptionalism, and there's no reason to have it when you're talking about biology. Okay? Now, a gentleman yesterday gave a talk which gave the exact opposite view of me, that sex is a spectrum. I don't have time to rebut it. I ran back to my room and made this slide showing that, rebutting every point that was made. You could take a picture of it if you want. But the main point is that just because your brain tells you that you're one thing doesn't mean that you are that thing. I know a lot of people, I've seen them, that, well, I don't know a lot of them, but they think they're animals. They really do think that they're horses or foxes or something else. Does that mean that we have to consider them foxes or horses? That's, of course, an extreme expression of this version. But just take a picture, and if you want to talk about this, I'll be glad to do it later, because we have to move on to the hottest potato of all, as Neil deGrasse Tyson talked about yesterday, which is race. And the statement, which is somewhat misleading, but not completely misleading, that race and ethnicity are social constructs without scientific or biological meanings. And as I'll try to show you, this statement is misleading because they're not social constructs. Even in the old and discarded notion of race, those races still had biological and scientific meaning. They were not social constructs. First of all, let's consider the question, do humans have biological races? My answer will be yes and no, by the way, so I don't know if you're satisfied with that. But we all know that as we look across the globe, we see that as we go from place to place, people look different from one another. They differ in their hair texture, they differ in their hair color, their eye color, their body shape, the shape of their ears, shape of their eyes, and of course pigmentation, which is the classic racial thing. But anyway, we know that populations of humans from different places are different biologically. So that already gets rid of the idea that populations are social constructs. What about race? I don't like to use the word race because it's become associated with the word racism, and that's a charged word. I like to use the word populations or ethnic groups, which is much more accurate than the old notion of race, which was that groups of humans are divided into a finite number of easily demarcated groups without any mixing between them. They're geographically different from one another, and they have huge genetic differences between them. Now, this view of race, which is the one that was obtained when I was a kid, is wrong, okay? That's not how, and that's why I want to use the word populations as groups of individuals that are more or less interbreeding instead of races. What we see across the world is groups of people that are more or less interbreeding. They do exchange genes with others, but not to the extent that all of humanity becomes genetically identical. There are still substantial and meaningful genetic differences between populations of humans, and they have biological and scientific significance. And that's all I want to say. I'm not saying that races are real, but I want to say that populations are different from one another, that not all humans throughout the globe are equal, and they differ in many ways. The statement, again, is race and ethnicity are social constructs without scientific or biological meaning. This is a statement of the American Medical Association in their guidelines for reporting race, and I've just taken their exact words from that article and put it at the top as the heading. So this is a widespread thing, and you have to ask yourself, what is a social construct? Something that's just made up that has no biological reality to it. Okay, well, first of all, we know that that's not true. There's a biological reality to populations. How many of you have had a 23andMe or Ancestry diagnosis test? Not many, really. You need to know your ancestry, although I don't know why. I mean, it doesn't tell you anything about yourself, really. I mean, some people feel that they've come into themselves when they get their 23andMe test. But I already knew what I was, and this is my 23andMe result. I'm 97% Ashkenazi Jew, and the other 2% is Eastern European, probably Jewish as well. This jives perfectly with what I know about my own ancestry, okay? So it was good. I mean, the test showed that the genetics that I have, the combination, and you have to do a combination of many genes that I carry in my genome, tell them that my ancestors came from Eastern European. And not only that, it told them probably what religion they were. And this is accurate. So this means that that's population differences in their genic content are not meaningless. They're not social constructs. They're real. And they're real because they help you tell what your ancestry is. This is my co-author's Luana's 23andMe test. She paid a little bit more to have all of her chromosomes ancestry diagnosed. And so here's 11 of her 23 pairs of chromosomes painted with their geographic origin, which is colored to match the area of the world on the left. And you can see that most of her chromosomal material is light blue. That means that that's from Spain. She considers herself Hispanic or Latino. She hates the word Latinx, so I won't use that. But there's also a lot from Italy, which is the purple, and she has a soupçon of genes from Africa, purple, sorry, and from North America, which are yellow. Okay. Again, populations differ genetically across the globe. Now, a lot of these genes don't do anything because 90% of our genome is junk. It doesn't do anything. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. But it's not just these meaningless things. There are meaningful things that your population can tell you, even if you construe population as one of the classical kinds of races. Here's a study that just came out recently in which they just took 4 of the classic races in America: Black, white, Hispanic, and East Asians. So people were self-identified this way. They just asked you, what is your race? And then they took their chest x-rays, and they gave all this data to AI, and AI learned from features that we don't even understand how to be able to diagnose someone's classical race from their chest x-rays. I can't even tell you what features were used because you know how AI works. It's very complicated. But they were given an unknown person of one of these 4 classical races. AI was able to diagnose them from their chest x-ray with 93% accuracy. This shows you that there are meaningful biological differences between even the classical races. I don't like to use the word race, but even the populations that are lumped into each classical race. Why has these differences occurred? It's because over the history of humanity, we left Africa about 60,000 years ago, went through Eurasia, crossed the Bering Strait 20,000 years ago, and we made it to Australia about 50,000 years ago. On the left, you see the barriers to that kind of migration. The brown areas are areas, and we determine this genetically by the amount of mixing on either side. Brown areas are impediments to human migration over history. You see the Sahara Desert at the top of Africa, and also the Himalayas. Blue areas are areas of fairly free intermixing. So what I'm trying to tell you here is the combination of genes that we have tells us something about the history of the movement of humanity. And that is not meaningless. That is not a social construct. If you take populations from this old world, and then you look at the combinations of genes from individuals in each population, color code and members of the different populations, and then do a statistical analysis, which is principal components analysis. Here, lo and behold, you see that individuals cluster according to their geographic location. So we have China and Siberia over here on the left. We have Europe over here at the top, Africa at the bottom, and Madagascar, which is a combination of genes from Filipinos and Africans. They're sitting in the middle. There's some remarkable coincidence between geography and genetic clustering. It tells you something. It tells you that where you sit on the genetic profile tells you something about where your ancestors came from. It's even more amazing if you look at Europe. On the map on the left, we have a map of Europe with the population sampled in black. And then we do a genomic analysis. And I think this is a complete analysis using whole genomes and lumping individuals. Each point is one individual based on their multi-locus combination of genes. And individuals, similar combinations cluster together in this principal components analysis. What do we see? Again, a map of genes which precisely maps, well, not precisely, there's some, but it's very close to the geographical map. So we have Scandinavians in light green, we have the British in red, and then Spanish, and you go around, Western Europeans in purple. This remarkable coincidence, again, tells us that populations are not social constructs without meaning. And some of these populations can be combined into parts of the classic races. You can do it within countries. Here's Italy. If you do a principal components analysis of the genes of Italians, you see they fall into 3 clusters: northern, central, and southern Italy. There's the colors that they correspond to, and also Sardinians, which are separate yet. Why is this? Well, you probably know the answer. It's because the people that settled in northern, central, and southern Italy have different ancestries. This is the history of Italy, the people that settled in different areas, and more or less there's a northern, central, and southern part, and Sardinians are different left. This, again, means that populations are not social constructs. To the extent that we can take a given European, sequence their genome, and guess with 99% accuracy within 500 kilometers where their ancestors came from. That's how good this method is, okay? But it's not only just genes, it's adaptive differences between populations. Here's Sarah Tishkov's graph showing different populations and these having different evolutionary adaptations: low oxygen tolerance, high cold, disease resistance, and of course pigmentation is the famous one, which is probably a result of incidence of solar light. All of these are adaptations that have evolved since humans spread across the globe about 60,000 years ago. So that's pretty quick. But these are not meaningless. I mean, these are really important. Lactose tolerance is another one. Countries where there's not a lot of milk drinking, like in China, have a low incidence of lactose tolerance, okay? Why is it important that we recognize these differences? Well, there's the trivial thing. You get to find out about your own ancestry, if that's important to you. But it also, and more importantly, if you combine it with ancient DNA, which we're now able to get from bones, and with artifacts that you can carbon date, it tells us the history of our species. If you do not recognize that these populations are different in a coherent way, we would not know when we left Africa, when we crossed the Bering Strait, when we settled the New World, when we got to Australia, okay? And finally, there's the medical results. We're now starting to find out that different populations, and indeed the different classical races, and I use that word again with temerity, have different incidences of diseases. And not only that, but the genetic basis for those diseases are different. We've just found out in the last couple of years that, for example, African Americans and whites have different incidences of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, but the genes behind them are different. And eventually we're going to have gene therapy to help people with these conditions. It's a ways off, but we have to know their ancestry in order to get an idea of which genes are causing these diseases and how to cure them. Now note that although we use dividing people up in populations in this endeavor, the goal is to help individuals. It's not to rank people or say that one group is better than another. It's to help individuals, and you get that help by recognizing that different groups have different genes. Okay, so why is the insistence on races being a social construct? Again, it's ideology, Jake. That is, if you feel that dividing people up into groups leads inevitably to the ranking of people and to the tracking of people in schools, and therefore to bigotry and racism, then you don't want to have differences between groups. And so that's why people deny that races or groups even exist that are genetically differentiated, social construct. Again, it's reading into nature the view that whatever we think is good for our society must exist. That is, the absence of differentiated groups. Now, the existence of these differences does not mean that the groups are unequal. And I have to emphasize this very strongly, that just because people are different from one another, or groups have average differences between one another, doesn't mean inevitably that there's a ranking of superiority or inferiority. People are equal in a moral and legal sense, and that is not affected by anything about their biology. I was giving a quote by Ernst Mayr to that effect: people that mistake genetic equality with moral and legal equality, but I don't have time to do that. I just want to finish with talking about 3 fallacies that are important. And the third one is the one that is the basis for this entire talk. You all know about the naturalistic fallacy, the idea that is equals ought. What you see in nature is what we should be doing in humans. You know, the fallacies of this, that makes our morality contingent on what we see in nature. And the biggest fallacy is there's lots of stuff that animals do that we don't want to do in our society. For example, forced copulation, murder, theft, widespread throughout the animal kingdom. Does not equal ought. A related fallacy is the appeal to nature, very related, which is what is natural is what is good. Good is different from what we ought to do in the sense that deontology is different from utilitarianism. Is equal to high value. This is also incorrect. It's a fallacy. But the fallacy that underlies all these ideological incursions into biology is this one. What I call the reverse appeal to nature. What is good is what is natural. That is what you want society to be constructed like, is what we must see in nature. It's a reversal of the naturalistic fallacy because it implies ought, it implies is. What we want is what we have. But, you know, nature doesn't care about what people want. It's just the way it is. And we have to deal with that. And so every one of the 6 examples of ideological incursion into biology is based on that. This fallacy, which I call the reverse appeal to nature. You cannot read what you want things to be like in humans. I mean, again, remember, I'm talking only about humans, not foxes or dragons or dragonflies or anything like that. Why are these distortions harmful? This is my last slide. Several reasons. First of all, it distorts biology. We do have a sex binary, and it's very useful, and it's universal. And we do have groups of populations that differ from one another in meaningful biologically ways. They misrepresent science and distort scientific knowledge. And not only that, but they're promulgated by scientists. We saw a doctor yesterday promulgate what I would say is deeply misleading views about sex. And this gives false authority to their claims. People know that populations differ from one another, and they know that some of that is genetic. People know that if you look across this room, you're going to be able to identify somebody as male or female, even without looking at their gametes, with about 100% accuracy. So when they hear scientists saying otherwise, and they do, they start distrusting science and distrusting higher education. And this is one of the reasons why I think this country is so divided, because people want to read their ideology into nature. And finally, these are some figures showing how the distrust in science has increased over the last 10 years. Confidence in scientists to act in the public interest has decreased drastically, and the ability of people to have trust in the university system in the United States has decreased from 27% to 36% in only 10 years. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for listening.